In this video, I'm going to explain how you fix damp plasterboard. Firstly, you need to determine the source of the damp and prevent it coming into the property to stand a chance of fixing your plasterboard. Only once you've located the source of the damp or the moisture can you then begin to repair it. If you've got an area that's been affected by mildew or mould, you need to treat the area and clean it before repairing. Whenever you're dealing with damp plasterboard, you want to wear some protective equipment. I'd recommend wearing a face mask and some goggles and some gloves. You don't really want to be breathing in the sort of damp plasterboard as you remove the affected area and replace it. To perform a proper fix on an area of damp plasterboard, really what you need to do is cut the plasterboard section out that's been affected by the damp and replace it with a fresh piece once you've identified the source of the damp and stopped it. So it's only once you've stopped the cause of the damp should you then start to repair your plasterboard. To repair your plasterboard, you're probably going to need a Stanley knife, a pad saw, a spirit level pencil, tape measure, and what you want to do is cut a square out of the affected area back to a joist, or if it's on a solid wall you need to cut out the plasterboard or chip out the area, and then you either need to replace it with some tanking and then skim over the top, or you need to replace your affected damp piece of plasterboard. If it's on a stud-work wall or a timber wall, you need to check that there's no damp still behind the stud wall. So if you cut a section of plasterboard out, you'll be able to see if there's damp behind the wall. If there's damp behind your timber wall, then you obviously need to find a solution for your damp before replacing the affected piece of plasterboard. To treat mould and mildew, you need to get yourself a damp sponge with some detergent and clean the affected area. Allow it to completely dry before applying a fungal wash over the entire area that's been affected. You may find that the damp area is caused by leaks. It could be caused by moisture getting into the property through the walls and sucking through. There could be damp, rising damp coming up from the bottom of the property. Whenever you get a damp plasterboard, quite often it's worth just biting the bullet and cutting out the affected area so you can see what's going on behind. Once you can identify the problem, you can then think about creating a solution and replacing the affected piece of plasterboard. Whenever you're assessing damp in properties, you always want to think about adequate ventilation. You can also use some techniques to reduce the chances of mould coming back or dampness coming back. You can actually buy a special type of plasterboard which is moisture resistant. It's often signified by this green colour. This is brilliant because it's the same thickness as conventional plasterboard. It's a little bit more expensive and it's actually treated with a chemical that actually prevents the growth of mould. So if you are patching in a damp area, it's always better to use some moisture resistant plasterboard rather than standard plasterboard. Once you've repaired your affected area, it's important that you regularly monitor it to check if the damp's returned. What I always like to do, cut out the damp plasterboard, see if there's any problems behind, identify those problems, fix the leaks or fix the rising damp with some DPC, and then I like to replace the plasterboard. I'd use some moisture resistant plasterboard and then I would just monitor it for a couple of days or a couple of weeks just to see if that damp's likely to return. If I think that I've solved the problem and I've kept the damp at bay, I'll then start to fill my edges around my plasterboard with some filler, sand it smooth and then paint it. But I'd only paint the affected area or the repair after I was 100% sure it was staying bone dry. If the damp persists and you've replaced the affected area of the plasterboard but it still keeps getting mouldy, I think at that point, after I'd had an attempt myself, I'd consult a professional. They'll come out and normally free of charge will have a look and help you identify the problem and hopefully rectify it. It's a relatively cheap fix to repair a damp plasterboard. All you'll need to do is buy some new plasterboard. You'll probably only need one new sheet if it's only a small area. I'd recommend you get moisture resistant plasterboard just to reduce the chance of damp occurring again, and it also reduces the chance of mould and mildew forming on the plasterboard. So if you have an area that's been affected by damp once, I'd recommend you repair it with some moisture resistant plasterboard. It's always important to prioritise safety when dealing with damp. And mouldy conditions. You don't want to breathe any of that into your lungs as it can cause health problems. So a good mask is always a wise choice. I hope this video has explained a little bit about how you deal with a damp plasterboard. If you found it helpful, drop us a like. And if you want more quick DIY tips, subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.